The light outside had dimmed into twilight by the time John Mason found himself alone in his living room, attempting to focus on a stack of paperwork from his firm. His work usually kept him occupied well into the evening, but something in the back of his mind tugged at him tonight. He couldn't shake a vague unease, something in his gut that made him uneasy. Just as he leaned back, trying to settle his nerves, he heard the front door open. Rachel's light footsteps were usually silent, but today they dragged, slow and heavy. John's gaze lifted, and what he saw froze him in place. Rachel, his beautiful, energetic 14-year-old, looked a shadow of herself. Her dark, curly hair fell messily over her face, which was blotched with red. Tears had traced paths down her cheeks, her eyes puffy and raw, and her shoulders slumped in defeat. "Rachel?" he asked, unable to keep the worry from his voice. She looked at him, eyes wide and brimming with something he couldn't name. Hurt, fear, shame, but she only shook her head slightly, as if to brush away the question. I'm fine, Dad," she whispered, though her voice trembled, betraying her words. She clutched her school bag as if it was her anchor, but her hand kept slipping, as if her strength was failing her. John's heart tightened as he rose from his chair. "Are you sure?" "Rachel, if something's wrong, you can tell me. You know that." She nodded quickly, even though it was clear she was far from fine. "I just had a hard day." And before he could say more, she darted upstairs, closing her door quietly but firmly, leaving him in the thick silence of their home. John stood there for a moment, wrestling with his instincts to follow her and demand to know what was happening. Rachel had always been an open book with him. They shared everything, had a bond built on trust. But lately he had noticed her slipping away, little by little. She no longer shared stories of her school day, her friends, or her dreams like she used to. The shift had been subtle at first, and he had brushed it off as the natural change of a teenager wanting more space. But tonight, with the tears and the tremor in her voice, he knew he could no longer ignore it. He paced the hallway, waiting for Marie, his wife, to come home. As he waited, he thought of the years he had spent building their family to feel safe and open, a space for Rachel to thrive, to grow. But tonight, that world seemed to be crumbling, and he didn't know why. When Marie arrived, he filled her in quietly, his own worry reflected in her wide eyes. "It's not like her, Marie. Something's wrong, and I feel like I'm failing her. She won't talk to me." Marie, always the voice of reason, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Maybe she needs time, John. She's at that age where things feel so much bigger than they are. She'll come to us." But that night, John couldn't shake the look in Rachel's eyes, the silence that had filled the house since she came home. When they sat down to dinner, Rachel joined them, her fork scraping her plate as she barely ate. Her silence cut through him like a knife, each minute heavy with unspoken fears. Finally, as she excused herself and returned to her room, John knew he couldn't let this go on. He decided he'd take matters into his own hands if she didn't open up by the weekend. The next morning, John woke with an aching sense of determination. Whatever had wounded Rachel so deeply, he was going to find out, even if it meant digging into her world a little more than he felt comfortable with. As he stepped into the kitchen, he found Rachel already dressed and preparing to leave, her face set in a mask of forced calm. "Hey, Rachel," he greeted, striving for normalcy. "How about I drive you to school today? We can grab a hot chocolate on the way." Rachel's shoulders tensed slightly, but she looked up and nodded. "Sure, Dad," she said quietly, clutching her backpack tightly. On the drive, John kept the conversation light, asking about her classes and friends, carefully observing her responses. She answered briefly, looking out the window, her face unreadable. When he parked outside the school, John hesitated. "Rachel, I want you to know, if anything's wrong, or if there's something happening at school, you can always talk to me. There's nothing you could say that would make me stop loving or protecting you." She looked down, then nodded, her eyes darting toward the doors of Somerton High. "I know, Dad," she murmured. But she still avoided his gaze. With a small forced smile, she whispered, "Thanks for the ride," and hurried out of the car, disappearing into the flow of students. As she walked away, a weight settled in John's chest, the feeling that he was sending her back into something that terrified her. He waited until she had vanished into the building before deciding he couldn't sit idly by any longer. It was time to talk to someone at the school. An hour later, he called and set an appointment with Mr. Fletcher, Rachel's homeroom teacher. The school administration's policies were strict about parent access to students' personal details, but he hoped Fletcher would give him some insight. "Mr. Mason, good to meet you," Mr. Fletcher greeted, a tall man with graying hair and an easy smile that seemed strained as they shook hands. "Please, sit down. I understand you're concerned about Rachel." "Yes, very much," John replied, leaning forward, his gaze intent on Mr. Fletcher. "She's been acting differently, avoiding us at home. I thought it might be stress or a social issue, but last night she came home visibly upset. She won't tell us what's wrong." Mr. Fletcher sighed, folding his hands together. "I wish I had an easy answer, Mr. Mason. Rachel is a bright, thoughtful student. She's always excelled here, but I have noticed she's become withdrawn over the past month. Her grades have slipped, and she's been quieter than usual. Do you think she's having trouble with other students? Has she mentioned anything?" Mr. Fletcher's gaze shifted, and he hesitated. "Well, Mr. Mason, I can't go into specifics, but I will say that school can be an intense environment, especially for kids who stand out. She's one of the only black students here, and there have been cases of subtle exclusion. Perhaps she's been affected by that. But we enforce a zero-tolerance policy on bullying." John's fists tightened at his sides, but he forced himself to stay composed. "I understand," he said, his voice measured. "But it's difficult to know that my daughter may be facing something like this in silence. Isn't there more you can do?" Mr. Fletcher's gaze softened. "I'll keep an eye on her, Mr. Mason, but I would also encourage you to keep reaching out to her. Sometimes students need time to open up, but I'll do what I can to ensure she feels safe here." John left the meeting with a tangled mix of frustration and relief. While he was grateful for Mr. Fletcher's insight, he felt helpless, as though he was missing something crucial. He had hoped to get a clearer sense of the situation, yet he was left with only vague reassurances. When he returned home that evening, Marie greeted him at the door, her face etched with worry. "Any luck?" He shook his head. "Mr. Fletcher said he'd look out for her, but it's clear something's happening at that school. Rachel's different, Marie. She's carrying something heavy, and I think it's beyond schoolyard troubles." Just as they were discussing, Rachel entered, surprising them with her early return. She seemed startled to see them talking in hushed tones and gave a brief, wary smile. "Hey, what's up?" she asked, her voice strained. "Hey, sweetheart," Marie replied, trying to keep her tone light. "We were just chatting. How was school?" "It was fine," she mumbled, her gaze drifting down as she hugged her backpack closer to her. "Just tired." She hurried past them to her room, leaving them standing in the entryway. The evening stretched on in tense silence. Rachel came down for dinner, but barely touched her food, and when John gently asked about her day, she simply nodded, saying it had been okay. Marie watched Rachel with worried eyes, her hand resting over John's on the table. "Rachel," she said softly, "if there's anything you need to share with us, we're here. You don't have to face it alone." Rachel looked up, her face pale and tight, as though she was on the verge of saying something. But then she shook her head, looking back at her plate. "Thanks, Mom, but I'm fine. Really." She excused herself quietly and went back upstairs, leaving her parents staring at each other in helpless frustration. Late that night, John found himself unable to sleep, replaying his conversation with Mr. Fletcher and the cold reception Rachel had given them. He worried if his pursuit of answers would make her pull back even more, but he couldn't let this go on any longer. Around midnight, He found himself drawn to Rachel's room, her door slightly ajar. Inside, he could see her sleeping form, curled up tightly, her brow furrowed as if even her dreams weren't free of worry. The sight broke his heart. How had he let things reach this point? What if something was happening at school? Something so dark she didn't know how to share it with them. The next morning, as she was about to leave for school, John handed her a small notebook. "Rachel," he said gently, "if you ever need to write something down, anything that's on your mind, maybe this could help." Rachel looked at the notebook, then up at him with a wary smile. "Thanks, Dad." She slipped it into her bag and hurried out the door. But that afternoon, John got a call that made his heart drop. "Mr. Mason, this is the school principal. I need you to come to the school. There's been an incident with Rachel." The drive to Somerton High was a blur. By the time he arrived, his pulse was racing, his mind conjuring 100 horrible scenarios. He rushed inside, barely registering the curious looks from students and staff as he made his way to the principal's office. When he entered, he found Rachel sitting there, her face pale and tear-streaked, eyes downcast. She looked up at him, and for the first time, John saw a look of pure fear in her eyes. "What happened?" he asked, turning to the principal, his voice a mixture of desperation and anger. The principal cleared his throat. "It seems Rachel was involved in a disturbance, Mr. Mason. She's been facing some issues with her classmates, and today it became more apparent." He looked at Rachel, his heart aching at the sight of her so vulnerable, sitting alone in the sterile office. "Rachel, is this true?" But she only nodded, biting her lip, the words caught in her throat. John's fists clenched. It was clear that there was more to this story, but he would need time and patience to get it out of her. For now, he took her hand and led her outside, his arm protectively around her shoulders. He vowed silently that he would uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The ride home was thick with silence, each second amplifying the questions swirling in John's mind. Rachel sat beside him, staring out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face expressionless. Every so often, John stole a glance at her, hoping for a flicker of explanation, but she remained a wall of silence. When they arrived home, Rachel quickly slipped from the car and headed toward her room. John let her go, knowing he couldn't force her to talk. Not yet, anyway. He needed to handle this carefully, without pushing her further away. A few hours later, he and Marie sat in the dim kitchen, cups of untouched tea between them. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of the house settling. Marie's face was etched with worry, her fingers tracing circles along the edge of her cup. "So they didn't explain what happened?" Marie asked, breaking the silence. "Not really," John replied, running a hand over his face. "The principal mentioned disturbances and said she's been having trouble with classmates, but they wouldn't give me any specifics. They acted as if it were routine, nothing to worry about." Marie's face darkened. "Routine. John, our daughter came home last night looking like she'd been through hell. And today, they call us down there for a so-called disturbance, and they think it's normal." John nodded grimly. "Exactly. And when I pushed for more information, they just brushed it off. I'm starting to feel like they're hiding something." Marie's hand tightened around her cup. "Rachel's been going to Somerton since she was little. It was supposed to be a place she could feel safe. How did we miss this? Why didn't we see this coming?" John shook his head, regret washing over him. "I thought I'd know if something was wrong. She's always trusted us, but now..." He trailed off, unsure of how to express the guilt gnawing at him. He felt he had somehow failed her, even if he didn't know what he'd done wrong. "Maybe..." Marie hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we need to consider that this isn't just about school. You know how people can be in this town. And Rachel, she's smart, she's ambitious, and she stands out." John nodded, understanding what she meant. They had seen it before, the looks, The whispers. Somerton had a reputation for its traditions, some of which were harder to break than others. They had assumed Rachel would be okay. That times had changed. But maybe they had been too naive, too trusting. Just as they were talking, Rachel emerged from her room and headed toward the back porch. Her face was drawn, her eyes rimmed with red. She gave them a brief nod as she passed, stepping into the cool evening air. John watched her for a moment, a mix of pride and sorrow welling in his chest. She was a resilient girl, but everyone had their limits. He waited a few moments before he joined her, easing onto the porch steps beside her. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" he ventured, his tone light. Rachel gave a small nod, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. They sat in silence for a while. The quiet stretch of the yard, a small comfort amid the tension hanging between them. After a few moments, Rachel spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you want to ask me questions," she said, her tone weary. "But I don't have answers. I don't even know where to start." John looked at her, a mixture of relief and sorrow tightening his throat. "Rachel, I don't need answers right now. I just need you to know that I'm here. Whatever you're going through, I'll be here every step of the way." Rachel bit her lip, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. She looked so young, so vulnerable, as if the weight of whatever burden she carried had drained her spirit. Finally, she spoke, her words a fragile whisper. There's something I need to tell you, but I'm scared, Dad." John's heart skipped a beat, and he took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever might come. "Rachel, whatever it is, I promise you don't have to be scared. I'm here, and nothing you say will change that." She swallowed hard, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I didn't want to tell you because I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to worry you and Mom, but things have been happening at school. Things I don't know how to stop." Her voice trembled, and John reached over, covering her hand with his own. "It's okay, Rachel. Take your time." Rachel took a shuddering breath, her fingers digging into his as if she were gathering strength from his touch. "It started with small things," she began, her voice wavering. "Comments, looks, people treating me like I didn't belong there. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it didn't bother me. But it's been getting worse. They do things now. Vandalize my locker, hide my things. She paused, her voice breaking. "They call me names. They act like I'm not worth anything, Dad." John's jaw clenched, a hot surge of anger flaring within him. He wanted to storm down to that school, to confront every person who had hurt his daughter. But he forced himself to stay calm, to be the steady presence she needed. "Rachel," he said softly, "I had no idea you were dealing with this. I'm so sorry you had to face this alone. But I promise you, you're not alone anymore. We're going to do something about this. No one has the right to make you feel this way." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I thought I could handle it, Dad. I thought if I ignored them, they'd stop. But they haven't. And it's like they get a thrill out of making me miserable." John's hand tightened over hers, a protective surge of anger surging through him. "Rachel, you don't have to endure this. I know you're strong, but no one deserves to go through what you're describing. Your mom and we're going to figure this out. And if it means getting involved with the school, talking to every parent, whatever it takes, we're going to make this right." Rachel nodded, her expression one of both relief and exhaustion. She had held this burden alone for so long, and finally she could lay it down, if only for a moment. They sat together on the porch for a while longer, the silence between them filled with unspoken promises. Later that evening, John made a call to the school board. He asked for an immediate meeting with the administration, with specific demands to address the hostile environment his daughter had been subjected to. The conversation was terse, and the response was less than enthusiastic, but he was relentless. They couldn't ignore him now. He would make sure of that. When he hung up, he felt a surge of determination, a deep-seated need to protect Rachel and bring accountability to those who had hurt her. He and Marie talked late into the night, discussing every possible course of action. They debated moving Rachel to a new school, but John could see the fight in Rachel's eyes, her desire to stand her ground, to not be driven away by the people who had sought to intimidate her. As the days passed, John and Marie doubled their efforts. They began reaching out to other parents, organizing meetings, collecting evidence of similar incidents from students and families who had faced subtle forms of bullying and discrimination. They built a coalition of voices, determined to hold the school accountable. With each step, Rachel's confidence began to rebuild, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. She knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt the strength of an army behind her, a family, friends, a community. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, John turned to her, his voice firm but gentle. "Rachel, you're not just standing up for yourself. You're standing up for every student who's ever felt out of place, who's been pushed aside or silenced. And I'm so proud of you for that." Rachel's eyes softened, her hand reaching out to squeeze his. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." As they sat together, a sense of peace settled over them, tempered by the knowledge that their fight was just beginning. But this time, Rachel was no longer alone. Together, they would face whatever came next. The following week, John and Marie's concerns took center stage at a meeting they had organized with the school board. Parents, teachers, and members of the community gathered in the Somerton High Gym, which buzzed with murmurs of anticipation. The room was packed, with concerned faces staring down at the front where a panel of board members sat, unprepared for the fervor about to unfold. John stood up, heart pounding with determination as he glanced at Rachel, who sat beside him. She looked stronger today, a quiet resolve lighting her eyes as she gave him a small nod. He returned it with a reassuring smile before stepping forward. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm yet firm. "I'm John Mason, Rachel's father, and I'm here to discuss the growing issue of discrimination and bullying within the school." The murmurs grew louder, and he saw parents exchanging glances, some nodding in agreement. But on the panel, a few faces tightened, arms crossing defensively. "My daughter, along with other students, has been subjected to ongoing harassment, both physical and emotional. This harassment isn't just about typical schoolyard teasing. It's deliberate, insidious behavior intended to make these students feel unwelcome. And we're here because that is unacceptable." Principal Harris, who sat among the board members, raised a hand, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mason, I want to assure you that Somerton High has a strict anti-bullying policy. Our teachers and staff are vigilant, and if there had been an issue, I'm sure we would have been notified." John met his gaze, a steely edge in his eyes. "Principal Harris, with all due respect, the issue has been ongoing, and attempts to address it have been met with dismissive responses. My daughter reported her experiences to staff members, and nothing was done. I called her homeroom teacher, Mr. Fletcher, and was brushed off." An uneasy tension rippled through the room, parents sitting straighter, eyes narrowing. John glanced over the crowd, recognizing familiar faces, parents whose children had also faced similar treatment but had been too afraid to speak up. "It's not just Rachel," he continued, his voice rising. "Several students have experienced exclusion, name-calling, and worse, and it's been brushed off as typical school behavior. But that's not acceptable. No student should feel unsafe at school. This is supposed to be a place of learning, not fear." A murmur of agreement spread, and a few parents raised their hands, eager to share their stories. One mother, Mrs. Alvarez, stood, holding a trembling hand up. Her son, Carlos, had been a classmate of Rachel's, and she looked directly at Principal Harris. "My son has faced similar treatment," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "He's been called names, had his things stolen, and when he asked for help, he was told to toughen up. He's 14. Why should he have to toughen up against this?" One of the board members, Mr. Whitman, leaned forward, frowning as he scribbled notes. "Mrs. Alvarez, we take these concerns seriously. I assure you, we will address any complaints filed by students. However, children do have disagreements." "This isn't about disagreements," John cut in sharply. "This is about targeted bullying. This is about making kids feel like they don't belong because of their race, their background, or simply because they're different. If Somerton High really wants to be a beacon of learning, then it's time we do something about this." Principal Harris attempted to regain control, clearing his throat. "Mr. Mason, Mrs. Alvarez, we're committed to creating a safe environment, but we can't always control what students say outside of class. Are you saying you're not responsible for the environment your students walk into every day?" John demanded, his voice reverberating through the gym. "The problem doesn't just start in the classroom. It starts when these kids are made to feel that their concerns don't matter, that they're supposed to handle it on their own. That's not what we teach them at home, and it shouldn't be what they learn here." Rachel watched, her heart swelling with pride and a deep sense of relief. Her father's words were a lifeline, an echo of everything she had been unable to say herself. The other parents who had been silent began to speak up, sharing stories that mirrored Rachel's experience. Parents nodded in support, some even tearing up as they recounted incidents their children had faced. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," Principal Harris said, his tone begrudging but resigned. "We will investigate these incidents further and make any necessary adjustments to our policies." "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," Principal Harris said, his tone begrudging but resigned. "We will investigate these incidents further and make any necessary adjustments to our policies." The crowd slowly dispersed, but John stayed behind, watching as a few parents gathered around Rachel, offering her quiet words of encouragement. Rachel looked overwhelmed but grateful, her eyes misting with emotion as she hugged John tightly. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "I was so scared I'd have to face this alone." John's heart clenched, and he hugged her back. "You'll never have to face anything alone, Rachel. Never." The days that followed brought a strange mix of quiet resolve and cautious optimism. John continued to meet with the school, pressing for concrete steps to be taken. He and Marie stayed vigilant, checking in with Rachel each day, watching her closely as she slowly began to regain her confidence. For the first time in weeks, Rachel started joining her friends for study groups and after-school activities, no longer rushing home to escape the day. She smiled more, spoke more freely, and the fear in her eyes gradually receded, replaced by a spark of courage and resilience. But one evening, as they gathered for dinner, Rachel's expression grew somber, her fork poised above her plate. She looked up, her gaze meeting John's, and her voice was quiet but firm. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you about Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John set down his fork, his heart sinking. "What is it, sweetheart?" Rachel took a deep breath, steadying herself. It's not just the students, Dad. Mr. Fletcher, he's part of it too." Marie's hand flew to her mouth, and John felt a rush of disbelief. "Are you saying he's been involved in this too?" Rachel nodded, her face flushed with shame and anger. "He'd make these comments about my work, about how people like me didn't always fit in here. I thought if I ignored it, it would stop. But—" She paused, her voice quivering. "He's the one who told some of the other students that I was getting special treatment because I'm different." John's fists clenched under the table, anger and betrayal coursing through him. The very person who was supposed to guide and support her had not only dismissed her struggles, but had actively contributed to her pain. "I'm so sorry, Rachel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never imagined someone in his position could do this." Rachel's gaze hardened. "Dad, I don't want to run away from this. I don't want to leave school or hide from them. I want them to know that they can't break me, that they don't get to decide where I belong." Her words struck John like a bolt of lightning, and he felt a fierce pride rising within him. His daughter was strong, far stronger than he could have imagined. He took her hand in his, meeting her gaze. "Then that's exactly what we'll do," he said, his voice unwavering. "We'll make sure they know that no one gets to treat you this way. Not now. Not ever." The next day, John brought the issue directly to the school board, detailing every incident with Rachel's unwavering support. They called in other students who had experienced similar issues, who spoke about Mr. Fletcher's biases, his underhanded comments, and his subtle but unmistakable role in fostering an environment of exclusion. At last, the weight of their stories and the collective evidence couldn't be ignored. Mr. Fletcher was suspended pending further investigation, and the school administration implemented a series of sensitivity and diversity workshops to address the root of the problem. It was only the beginning, but as Rachel stood outside the school building with her parents by her side, she felt a newfound strength in her chest. This school, this town, these people, they no longer had power over her. She knew who she was, and no amount of hate could take that away. As she turned to John, her voice filled with gratitude, she whispered, "Thank you, Dad, for helping me find my voice." John smiled, his pride for his daughter shining in his eyes. "Rachel, you always had it. We just helped you let it out." The days following Mr. Fletcher's suspension were a whirlwind of changes at Somerton High. The story of Rachel and the other students had spread, reaching beyond the school walls and drawing attention from the wider community. Parents, students, and even local news outlets took an interest, some expressing outrage, others sharing their own experiences and rallying behind Rachel and her family. Rachel felt a weight lifted, but she also felt the enormity of what she had set in motion. She had found her voice, but using it meant facing a new level of scrutiny and attention she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just a student. She was now a symbol of resilience, a face of change in a place where people had grown comfortable with silence. One afternoon, as she walked through the halls, students who once ignored her now offered nods or quiet words of support. A few even joined her in class projects, breaking the walls of isolation that had once surrounded her. For the first time in weeks, Rachel felt like she could breathe. But not everyone shared this newfound respect. There were those who saw her actions as an attack on the school's good name, those who believed she had gone too far. Some students still shot her hostile glances, whispers of troublemaker and attention seeker trailing behind her. Even some teachers kept their distance, as if siding with her would betray the unspoken tradition they'd lived with for years. Rachel was gathering her books from her locker one morning when a group of students passed by, shooting her pointed looks. She tried to ignore them, but the words reached her ears like venom. "Guess anyone can get a teacher fired these days," one of them muttered, his voice thick with disdain. "All it takes is a sob story." Another girl chimed in, laughing. "Yeah, the school's really gone downhill. I wonder what else she'll ruin next." Rachel's stomach tightened, her hand gripping the edge of her locker. The instinct to respond, to defend herself, surged, but she took a deep breath, calming herself. This was just noise. She was stronger than their words. As she closed her locker and turned to head to class, she spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Sarah, one of her closest friends from her early years at Somerton. They hadn't spoken much in recent months, the pressures of school and Rachel's isolation having driven them apart. Sarah approached her, an uncertain smile on her face. "Rachel, hey," Sarah said, her voice tentative. "Hey, Sarah," Rachel replied, forcing a small smile. Sarah hesitated, shifting nervously. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I should have been there for you when things got tough. I knew things weren't right, but I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed quiet. I thought maybe if I ignored it, it would go away." Rachel looked at her friend, seeing the genuine regret in her eyes. "Thanks, Sarah. I get it. It wasn't easy for me to talk about it either." Sarah bit her lip, looking down. "But you did. You spoke up when no one else would. That's brave, Rachel. And if you're okay with it, I'd like to be here for you now. I don't want to be a silent bystander anymore. Rachel's smile grew, warmth flooding her heart. I'd like that, Sarah. Thank you. The two walked to class together, a small but meaningful act that reminded Rachel she wasn't alone in her fight. And as the day continued, she felt the quiet support of more friends and classmates, a reminder that while there would always be critics, there would also be those who stood by her. Meanwhile, John was engaged in a battle of his own. The community's reaction to Rachel's story had stirred not only support, but also backlash. Some parents, outraged by the disruption to the school's reputation, voiced complaints at town hall meetings, questioning whether Rachel's situation had warranted such extreme measures. One evening, as John arrived at a town hall meeting, he found himself face to face with a group of parents, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and hostility. "Mr. Mason," one parent said, her voice edged with irritation, "we understand you want to protect your daughter, but this whole situation has blown out of proportion. Somerton has always been a respectable school. Your accusations have brought unnecessary attention." John remained calm, his voice unwavering. If respectable means allowing students to suffer in silence, then maybe it's time for Somerton's reputation to change. Another father stepped forward, his arms crossed defensively. "So you think suspending Mr. Fletcher was the right call? He's been teaching here for over 20 years. All this over a few hurt feelings." John took a steady breath, controlling the anger simmering beneath the surface. This isn't about hurt feelings. This is about ensuring every child feels safe and valued, regardless of who they are. Mr. Fletcher may have been here for years, but that doesn't excuse his actions. The students he's belittled, the damage he's done, they are real, and they matter. The meeting continued with a heated exchange, some in the community siding with John, others defending the school's traditional values. But for John, there was no turning back. He had seen the pain in Rachel's eyes, the weight she carried, and he refused to let anyone diminish that. His daughter's courage had reignited his own, and he would fight until the end to secure her right to a safe, supportive education. The following day, the principal called an assembly, addressing the entire student body and staff. Principal Harris stood at the podium, his expression one of forced neutrality. John, who had been invited to attend, sat near the front, with Rachel by his side. "We are here today to acknowledge the recent events that have sparked concern within our school community," Principal Harris began, his voice carrying a carefully measured tone. "Somerton High is committed to providing a respectful and inclusive environment for all students. We are implementing new policies to ensure that every student's concerns are heard, and we will be conducting regular workshops on diversity and respect." The words sounded scripted, a formality rather than a genuine commitment, but John saw a flicker of something in Rachel's eyes, a glimmer of validation. Change was coming, even if it was slow, even if it came with resistance. After the assembly, a few students approached Rachel, offering words of encouragement and thanks. Some shared their own experiences, confiding in her the struggles they'd faced. Others simply nodded in support, their silent solidarity speaking louder than words. Slowly, Rachel began to feel the weight on her shoulders lifting, replaced by a sense of purpose and strength. As the weeks passed, Somerton High continued to feel the ripples of change. Teachers and students participated in diversity training sessions, and an anonymous reporting system was implemented, allowing students to report issues without fear of retribution. Rachel and her family continued their work, attending meetings, offering feedback, and supporting other students who found the courage to speak up. One day, after another long meeting with the school board, Rachel and John walked together through the quiet halls of Somerton High. The walls, once intimidating, now felt less oppressive, as if the shadows that had lurked there were finally beginning to recede. "Dad," Rachel said, her voice soft but resolute, "I never thought I'd have the courage to do all this. I didn't think I could make a difference." John looked at her, pride swelling in his chest. "Rachel, you've done more than make a difference. You've changed things, for yourself, for others, for this whole school. It takes incredible courage to speak out, to stand up. You're stronger than you know. Rachel smiled, her gaze drifting to the familiar hallways, the classrooms where she had once felt invisible, unwelcome. Now, they felt different. They felt like her space, a place she had fought to make safe, not only for herself, but for everyone. They stopped near her locker, and Rachel looked up at her father, her eyes shining with gratitude and determination. "Thank you, Dad, for everything. I don't think I could have done this without you." John's heart ached with pride, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Rachel, you've been the one leading this from the beginning. You just needed a reminder of how powerful your voice is. I'm proud of you, not just for what you've done, but for who you are." Together, they walked out of the school, a sense of peace settling over them as they stepped into the bright afternoon light. The journey wasn't over. There would still be obstacles, resistance, and challenges ahead. But Rachel knew, with a renewed sense of self and the unwavering support of her family, that she was ready for whatever came next. Months had passed since that pivotal day at Summerkin High. The school had since undergone a subtle transformation, and though the changes were gradual, they were undeniable. The diversity workshops had grown into a regular part of the school's curriculum, fostering an environment where students felt safer expressing themselves. New support groups formed, and the administration had created a student-led committee that oversaw the reporting system, a place where students like Rachel could seek help without fear of being dismissed or ignored. As for Rachel, the quiet courage she had once kept hidden had blossomed into a fierce self-assurance. She walked the halls of Summerkin High with her head held high, no longer weighed down by the whispers, glares, or cold stares from a few lingering detractors. She had proven that their opinions could no longer diminish her. But the journey hadn't come without its costs. Friendships had shifted, and some people she had once trusted had revealed themselves to be less supportive than she had hoped. Yet, Rachel knew that standing up for herself had been the right choice. She had uncovered her strength and found a community that valued her voice. One late afternoon, as the school year neared its end, Rachel sat in the library, sifting through a pile of books and notes as she prepared for a final project. Her teacher, Mr. Sampson, had encouraged her to explore the topic of strength in diversity, and Rachel was eager to take on the challenge, seeing it as a way to honor her journey. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't notice a group of students enter the library until they approached her table. She looked up, surprised to see Sarah and a few other classmates, their faces open and warm. "Hey, Rachel," Sarah began, a small smile on her face. "We were wondering if you might need a hand with your project." Rachel felt a surge of warmth and gratitude. She had been so used to doing things on her own, so accustomed to standing alone, that the offer of help touched her deeply. She smiled, nodding. "I'd love that. Thank you." As they worked together, the group shared stories and laughter, a lightness in their conversation that had once been rare for Rachel. These were people who saw her for who she was, who valued her for her resilience and courage. She knew now that she wasn't just different in their eyes. She was a friend, a leader, and a voice for change. The day of her presentation arrived, and Rachel stood before her classmates with a quiet confidence. She spoke of the importance of diversity, of the strength that comes from facing adversity, and of the power each person holds to make a difference. She didn't share every detail of her own story, but as she spoke, she saw the understanding in her peers' faces. They knew, and they respected her for it. When she finished, the room fell into a deep, thoughtful silence before a soft applause filled the space. For the first time in her life, Rachel felt fully seen, fully accepted, and fully respected. She smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't known before. Later that evening, John and Marie took Rachel out to celebrate her accomplishments. They laughed and reminisced, the tension and worry that had once weighed down their conversations now replaced by a lightheartedness that felt new and refreshing. As they finished dinner, Marie raised her glass in a small toast. "To Rachel," she said, her voice full of pride. "To her strength, her courage, and her incredible heart." Rachel blushed, laughing as her parents clinked glasses with her, but she felt her heart swell with gratitude. She had faced darkness, but she had emerged stronger, and she knew that her parents had been with her every step of the way. As the weeks passed, Rachel continued her journey, but the experience had forever changed her. She had gained the courage to speak up, not just for herself, but for others who couldn't yet find their own voices. She began mentoring younger students, sharing her story with those who struggled with their own identity or felt out of place, hoping to inspire them to see their worth and strength. But her influence extended beyond the walls of Somerton High. She was invited to speak at community events, sharing her journey and offering insight on how schools and communities could work together to create safe spaces for all. Her words resonated, reaching people who, like her, had once felt isolated and silenced. One afternoon, a letter arrived for Rachel in the mail. She tore it open, curious, only to feel her heart leap as she read the words inside. She had been offered a scholarship to a summer leadership program that focused on building resilience and advocating for social justice. It was an opportunity she hadn't expected but welcomed wholeheartedly. When she told her parents, John's face lit up with pride. "Rachel, you're going to do amazing things," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is only the beginning." As she hugged her father, a quiet gratitude filled her heart. She thought back to that dark day in the school bathroom when she had felt so small, so powerless. She thought of the tears she had shed, the fear that had gripped her heart, and the loneliness that had weighed her down. And now, as she looked toward her future, she knew those feelings were a part of her past. She was no longer defined by what others thought of her, but by the strength she had discovered within herself. The day she left for the program, her parents saw her off at the airport. John hugged her tightly, his voice filled with pride. "Rachel, remember, you are capable of anything. Never forget that your voice matters." Marie hugged her next, her eyes misting with tears. "And remember, no matter where you go, you have a family who loves you and stands with you. You're never alone." Rachel boarded the plane with her heart full, knowing that this was the next step in a journey that had changed her life. As the plane ascended, she looked out the window, her thoughts drifting to all the challenges she had overcome. She had learned to embrace her strength, to find her voice, and to walk with her head held high, no matter what others might think. A few days into the program, Rachel was asked to share her story with the group. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the eager faces around her, each person waiting to hear what she had to say. And as she began, she felt a rush of pride and gratitude, knowing that her story had the power to inspire and uplift. "Hi, I'm Rachel," she began, her voice steady and sure. "And this is the story of how I learned to stand up, not just for myself, but for others too. I used to think I was alone, but I've learned that strength isn't about standing alone. It's about finding the courage to reach out, to ask for help, and to believe in the power of community." As she spoke, she could see the impact her words were having, the glimmers of understanding and empathy in the eyes of those around her. She knew that, like her, they had faced struggles, and that her journey resonated with them in ways words alone couldn't capture. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before erupting in applause. People came up to her afterward, sharing their own stories, thanking her for her honesty, and expressing admiration for her courage. That night, as she lay in her dorm room, Rachel reflected on everything she had been through, every struggle and every victory. She had discovered the strength that had always been within her, and she knew that her journey was just beginning. There were still challenges to face, still battles to fight, but she was ready. She was no longer the girl who hid in the bathroom, afraid and alone. She was Rachel Mason, strong, resilient, and ready to make a difference in the world. And as she closed her eyes, a quiet sense of peace settled over her, a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she would go. She had found her voice, and she knew she would never let anyone silence it again.